I kept my eyes shut tight as I heard my bedroom door creak open at 2 in the morning. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure she'd hear it. Through my barely open eyelids, I could make out her silhouette moving toward my nightstand. Slow, careful steps across the carpet I'd known for 30 years. The phone in my hand, hidden beneath the blanket, was still recording. I'd started it the moment I heard her footsteps in the hallway. This was the third night in a row. The red light blinked once, twice, capturing everything. I heard the soft scrape of the drawer sliding open, the one where I kept my late husband's watch and my grandmother's ring. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to stay perfectly still, my chest rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep. Then I heard it, the gentle clink of metal against wood. She was taking something. My fingers tightened around the phone under the covers as I watched her shadow move back toward the door. When it finally clicked shut, I sat up in the darkness, my whole body shaking. I pressed stop on the video and stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the play button. What I'd just recorded was about to change everything. And the next morning, when I showed it to my son, my daughter-in-law would drop to her knees in my living room, tears streaming down her face, begging me not to let anyone else see what was on that phone. I'm Margaret, and before I go on with this story, I'd love to know something. Where are you listening from? I always read the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, go ahead and subscribe, so I can share more with you. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, but it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know the least. It all started 3 weeks after my daughter-in-law Rachel moved into my house. My son Thomas had called me one Sunday afternoon, his voice tight with that particular strain I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant he needed something but didn't want to ask. He explained that they were renovating their kitchen, that the whole house was practically unlivable, and could Rachel possibly stay with me for a month or two while he traveled for work? Of course I said yes. I'd been living alone in this big old house since my husband Robert passed 4 years ago, and the empty rooms echoed with memories I sometimes wished I could escape. Rachel arrived on a Tuesday with 3 large suitcases and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was beautiful in that effortless way some young women are. Long dark hair always perfectly styled, clothes that looked expensive even when they were casual. She'd married my Thomas 2 years earlier, and I'd tried so hard to build a relationship with her, but there was always something like glass between us. Polite, distant, cold, if I'm being honest. The first week went smoothly enough. We moved around each other like careful dancers, never quite touching, never quite connecting. She spent most of her time in the guest room upstairs, the one with the big window overlooking the garden. I'd hear her on the phone sometimes, her voice low and urgent, conversations that would stop abruptly when I walked past the door. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being a paranoid old woman with too much time on her hands. But then small things started disappearing. Nothing major at first. A silver bookmark I kept on my nightstand. One of Robert's old cufflinks I'd left in a dish in the living room. I'd search for them, convinced I'd simply misplaced them, chalking it up to my aging memory. My sister Helen had been telling me for years that I was getting forgetful, and maybe she was right. Maybe I was just losing track of things the way elderly people do. On the 8th day, I noticed that the photograph of Robert and me on our honeymoon, the one I kept on the dresser in my bedroom, had been moved. It was subtle, just a few inches to the left, but I knew. I'd placed that frame in the exact same spot every single day for 4 years. I'd dust around it carefully, put it back precisely where it belonged. That night at dinner, I watched Rachel across the table as she pushed her salad around her plate, and I wondered if I should say something. But what would I say? That I thought she was moving my things? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. The next afternoon, I came home from my weekly grocery trip to find Rachel coming down the stairs, her face flushed. She startled when she saw me, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, Margaret," she laughed, but it sounded forced. "You scared me. I didn't hear you come in." I smiled and told her I'd just forgotten my reusable bags in the car, that I'd only been gone a minute. But I hadn't forgotten anything. I'd been sitting in the driveway, watching the house through my rearview mirror. That evening, I went to my jewelry box, the mahogany one Robert had given me on our 10th anniversary. I kept it in the back of my closet, behind my winter sweaters. My fingers trembled as I opened it, counting through the pieces. Everything was there. My mother's pearl necklace, my sapphire earrings, my wedding band that no longer fit my swollen fingers. But something felt wrong. The items weren't arranged the way I always left them. The pearl necklace was on top instead of underneath. Someone had been through this box. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The rational part of my brain said I was overreacting, that Rachel had no reason to go through my things. But the instinct that had kept me alive for 73 years, the one that had warned me when my first husband was lying about his gambling debts, that same instinct was screaming now. I thought about calling Thomas, but what would I tell him? That I suspected his wife of moving my jewelry around? He'd think I was losing my mind. For 3 days, I watched and waited. I marked the position of items in my room with tiny pieces of thread, invisible unless you knew to look for them. I placed a hair across my jewelry box lid, old tricks my mother had taught me during the war, when you couldn't trust anyone and supplies were precious. Every evening I'd check, and every evening something had been disturbed. The thread moved, the hair gone. Someone was coming into my room while I was out. On the 4th day, I bought a small camera at the electronics store downtown. The young man who helped me looked amused when I asked for something discreet, something that could record without anyone knowing. He probably thought I was a paranoid old woman. Maybe I was. But I set it up on my bookshelf, hidden behind a thick volume of poetry I knew no one would touch. The red light was barely visible, just a tiny pinprick that you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. The first night, nothing happened. I reviewed the footage on my laptop. 6 hours of an empty bedroom, the afternoon light slowly fading through the curtains. The second night, the same. I started to feel foolish, started to think maybe I really was just forgetting where I'd put things. My sister's words echoed in my head. Margaret, you're not as young as you used to be. It's normal to misplace things. But on the 3rd night, the footage showed Rachel entering my room at 1:47 p.m. I'd been at my book club meeting, which she knew about because I'd mentioned it at breakfast. I watched the screen with my hand over my mouth as she moved through my room, opening drawers, looking through my closet. She wasn't stealing anything in that video, just searching, methodical and careful, looking for something specific. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the old house, wondering what she was searching for. The next morning at breakfast, Rachel was especially cheerful, asking me about my book club, complimenting the coffee. Her performance was flawless. If I hadn't seen the video, I would have believed every word. I smiled and nodded and felt my stomach turn over with each of her lies. That afternoon, I moved the camera. Instead of the bookshelf, I hid it inside an old hat box on top of my wardrobe, angling it down toward my nightstand and dresser. If she came back, when she came back, I'd capture everything. I also made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I would pretend to be out, but actually stay home. I would catch her in the act. The opportunity came 2 days later. I told Rachel I had a doctor's appointment in the city, that I'd be gone most of the afternoon. I made a show of getting ready, putting on my good coat, checking my purse for my insurance card. She was in the kitchen when I called out goodbye, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or anticipation. I drove my car around the corner and parked 2 blocks away, then walked back through the neighbor's yard and let myself in through the back door as quietly as I could. I sat in the laundry room downstairs, my heart hammering, my phone in my hand with the camera app open. I'd connected it to the hidden camera through some app the electronics store employee had helped me set up. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard the stairs creak, soft footsteps moving down the hallway, my bedroom door opening. I watched the phone screen as Rachel came into view, and this time she moved with purpose. She went straight to my nightstand and pulled open the drawer. Inside was my late husband's watch, a Rolex his father had given him, worth at least $15,000. I watched her pick it up, turn it over in her hands, examining it in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, taking several photographs of the watch from different angles. My throat tightened. She was cataloging my valuables. But she didn't take the watch. She put it back carefully, exactly as it had been. Then she moved to my dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept my important papers, my will, Robert's life insurance documents, the deed to the house. She photographed those too, page after page, her phone camera clicking silently as she documented everything. I felt sick watching her, this woman my son had married, this stranger in my home, violating every boundary of trust and decency. When she moved to my closet, I almost stood up to confront her right then. She found the jewelry box within seconds, as if she'd known exactly where to look. She opened it and began photographing each piece, laying them out on my bed to get better angles. The pearl necklace, the sapphire earrings, my grandmother's diamond ring that I'd planned to give to Thomas's future daughter someday. Each click of her camera felt like a small theft, even though she wasn't taking anything. Not yet. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. When she finished, she arranged everything back precisely as she'd found it, or at least as precisely as she thought it had been. Then she left my room, closing the door with barely a sound. I waited in the laundry room, my whole body shaking, until I heard her footsteps go back upstairs to the guest room. Only then did I let myself breathe. I sat there in the dark laundry room for another hour, trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. She wasn't stealing, not in the traditional sense. She was documenting, cataloging, making a record of everything valuable I owned. The question that burned in my mind was simple and terrible. Why? What was she planning? And should I confront her now, or wait to see what she'd do next? That night at dinner, I could barely look at her. She chatted pleasantly about her day, mentioned she'd been watching movies and reading in her room. Every word was a lie. Every smile was a mask. I pushed my food around my plate and wondered how my son could have married someone capable of such deception. Had he known? Was he part of this? The thought made me feel sick, but I had to consider it. After Rachel went upstairs, I sat in the living room with my laptop, reviewing all the footage from the past week. I saw her enter my room 4 separate times, always when she thought I was out. Always searching, photographing, documenting. I made copies of everything, saved them to a flash drive, emailed them to myself. I'd learned long ago that evidence was only useful if you protected it. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Martin Pierce, who'd handled Robert's estate and had been our family attorney for 25 years. I didn't tell him everything on the phone, just asked if I could come by his office that afternoon. Something in my voice must have alarmed him because he cleared his schedule immediately. I brought my laptop and the flash drive, and I watched his face as I showed him the videos. His expression grew darker with each clip. "Margaret," he said carefully when the last video finished, "do you know what she's doing with these photographs?" I shook my head. That was the question I couldn't answer, the piece I couldn't figure out. Martin leaned back in his leather chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "In my experience, people document assets for one of 3 reasons: insurance fraud, divorce proceedings, or estate planning." The words hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. Estate planning. The phrase made my blood run cold. I was 73 years old, healthy, but not young. If something happened to me, everything I owned would go to Thomas. That was clearly stated in my will. But if Rachel had those photographs, if she had documentation of every valuable item I owned, she could claim anything was missing after I died. She could say I'd promised her things. She could dispute the will. Or worse, and this thought made my hands start shaking again, she could be planning something more immediate. Martin must have seen the fear in my face because he reached across the desk and took my hand. "Margaret, I want you to be very careful. Don't confront her yet. Don't let her know you're aware of what she's been doing." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen situations like this before, and they rarely end well when people feel cornered. Give me a few days to look into some things. Can you do that? Can you pretend everything is normal?" I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Pretend everything was normal? I'd been doing that for 3 weeks already, and each day felt like wearing a mask that was slowly suffocating me. But Martin was right. I needed more information before I made any moves. I needed to understand what Rachel was planning. And most importantly, I needed to protect myself, because if my instincts were right, I might be in more danger than I'd realized. That night, I decided to take the most terrifying gamble of my life. I would catch Rachel in the act, not just on camera, but in person. I would pretend to be asleep in my own bed and wait for her to come into my room. If she was documenting my things during the day when I was out, what was she doing at night when she thought I was sleeping? The camera couldn't capture everything from its hiding spot in the hat box. But if I was there, if I recorded her with my phone, I'd have evidence that even she couldn't explain away. It took 2 nights of lying awake in the dark, my phone hidden under my blanket, before it finally happened. At 2:17 a.m., I heard my bedroom door creak open. I kept my breathing slow and steady, the way I'd practiced for 2 nights. In through my nose, out through my mouth, the rhythm of deep sleep. My phone was already recording under the blanket, the screen facing down so no light would give me away. Through my barely open eyelids, I watched Rachel's silhouette move across my bedroom floor. She was wearing dark clothes, black leggings and a navy sweater, like she'd dressed specifically to be invisible in the darkness. That detail alone told me this wasn't innocent. This was calculated. She moved past my bed toward the dresser, and I heard the soft slide of the top drawer opening, the one with my important documents. My heart was pounding so loud I was certain she'd hear it, but I forced myself to stay perfectly still. I could hear papers rustling, the distinctive sound of her phone camera clicking quietly as she photographed page after page. My will, Robert's insurance papers, the deed to the house. Each click felt like a violation, like she was stealing pieces of my life even though nothing was physically leaving the room. But then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled out my will. I recognized it by the blue backing paper Martin always used, and she stood there reading it by the dim light of her phone screen. Her face was illuminated for just a moment, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. It wasn't guilt or shame or even greed. It was calculation, cold, careful planning. She was studying that document like a student preparing for an exam, and I realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that she was looking for loopholes. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, she carefully replaced everything. But she didn't leave. Instead, she turned toward my nightstand, toward the drawer where Robert's Rolex was kept. I watched through my eyelashes as she opened it slowly, so slowly, making sure it didn't creak. She lifted out the watch and held it up to examine it, turning it over in her hands. Then she did something that made my breath catch in my throat. She tried to put it in her pocket, but the watch was too bulky, the pocket too small. She stood there for a moment, seeming to weigh her options, and then she put it back. Not because she didn't want to take it, I realized, but because she couldn't figure out how to take it without me noticing it was gone in the morning. She was thinking ahead, planning, making sure she didn't tip her hand too early. That's when I understood. This wasn't impulsive. This was a long game, and I was the target. She moved to my closet next, and I heard the soft rustle of her going through my clothes. What was she looking for? Then I heard a different sound, the metallic scrape of hangers being pushed aside, and I realized she'd found the jewelry box. I'd moved it after the last incident, hidden it inside an old hat box on the top shelf, but somehow she'd found it anyway. Had she been searching my room more thoroughly than I'd realized? How many times had she been in here that I didn't know about? The jewelry box opened with its familiar soft creak. I risked opening my eyes just a fraction more and saw her silhouetted against the closet, the box open in her hands. She was taking items out one by one, photographing them again. But this time she was doing something else too. She was trying them on. I watched as she held my mother's pearl necklace up to her throat, admiring it in the darkness. Then my grandmother's diamond ring, slipping it on her finger, turning her hand this way and that. The sight of her wearing my grandmother's ring, the one my grandmother had worn through the Depression, through the war, through 53 years of marriage, filled me with a rage so pure and hot that I almost forgot to keep pretending to sleep. My hand tightened around the phone under the blanket, my finger pressing harder on the record button as if that could somehow capture the violation I was witnessing. She had no right. No right to touch those things. to try them on like she was shopping, like they already belonged to her. But I stayed still. I stayed quiet, because Martin's words kept echoing in my head. Don't let her know you're aware. People do desperate things when they feel cornered. So I watched as Rachel photographed herself wearing my jewelry, watched as she carefully returned each piece to the box, watched as she hid the box back in the hat box exactly as she'd found it. She was meticulous, thorough. This wasn't her first time doing something like this. When she finally left my room, closing the door with barely a whisper of sound, I waited 5 full minutes before I moved. My whole body was shaking. From fear, from anger, from the sheer effort of staying motionless for so long. I sat up in bed and stopped the recording, then played it back with the volume on the lowest setting, my hand cupped around the phone speaker. The video was dark, grainy, but you could see everything. Her going through my drawers, reading my will, trying on my jewelry. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 2:17 a.m. to 2:34 a.m. 17 minutes of pure documented proof. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my bed with my laptop, uploading the video to 3 different cloud storage accounts, emailing it to myself and to Martin, saving it on 2 different flash drives that I hid in different parts of the house. I'd learned from my father, who'd survived the war by being paranoid and careful. Always have a backup. Always protect your evidence, because people can take anything from you except what you've hidden well enough. As the sun started to rise, painting my bedroom in shades of gray and pale gold, I made a decision. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't spend another night in this house wondering if Rachel was going to escalate from documenting to actually stealing, or worse. I needed to talk to Thomas. He was still traveling for work, but he was due back in 3 days. 3 more days of pretending everything was fine. 3 more days of living with someone who was plotting something dark behind my back. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. That morning, after Rachel left for what she said was a yoga class, I did something I'm not proud of. I went into her room. I told myself it was self-defense, that she'd violated my privacy first, that I had every right to protect myself. But standing there in her doorway, looking at her neatly made bed and her closed suitcases, I felt like a criminal. Her laptop was sitting on the desk by the window. I opened it, expecting a password, but it went straight to the home screen. That was the first surprise. Who doesn't password protect their computer? Unless they never expected anyone to look. Her email was open, and I started scrolling through the inbox, my heart pounding, waiting for something to jump out at me. Most of it was mundane. Newsletters, shopping confirmations, spam. But then I saw an email thread with a name I didn't recognize. David Chen, attorney at law. My hands started shaking as I opened the email. It was dated a week ago, just a few days after Rachel had moved into my house. The subject line read, Estate documentation and asset verification. I had to read the first paragraph 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. Rachel had hired a lawyer, and she was asking about how to contest a will, what kind of evidence was needed to prove undue influence, and whether photographs of assets could be used to claim that items had been promised to her before the testator's death. The lawyer's response was careful and professional, but the implications were clear. He explained that in estate disputes, documentation was crucial. That if someone could prove they had a relationship with the deceased and had been promised specific items, especially valuable ones, those items might be awarded outside the will's provisions. He mentioned that photographs showing the claimant with the items, especially if they appeared to be gifts or loans, could be powerful evidence. My stomach turned as I realized what Rachel's plan was. She was building a case, not for now, but for after I died. Every photograph she took of herself wearing my jewelry, every image of my valuables, every document she'd copied, it was all preparation. She was creating a narrative where I'd promised her these things, where I'd treated her like a daughter, where she had every right to claim what she wanted when I was no longer around to contradict her story. It was brilliant in a sick, twisted way, and it was probably legal, or at least legal enough that it would tie up my estate in court for years. I kept reading through her emails, my horror growing with each new thread. There was an email to a real estate appraiser, asking about property values in my neighborhood. An email to an antiques dealer with photographs of Robert's watch and my mother's pearl necklace, asking for valuations. An email to someone named Marcus, complaining about having to stay in the old woman's house for another few weeks, but that it would be worth it in the end. That phrase made my skin crawl. Worth it in the end. The worst email was the most recent one, sent just yesterday. It was to Thomas, my son, my only child. The subject line was, "Your mother's health." I clicked it open with trembling fingers. Rachel had written, "Tommy, I'm getting worried about your mom. I've noticed she's been very forgetful lately, leaving doors open, misplacing things, getting confused about what day it is. I think she might be showing early signs of dementia. Maybe we should talk about having her evaluated? I know it's hard, but we need to think about her safety. And honestly, we should probably make sure all her affairs are in order, just in case. I love you. R." I had to close the laptop and step away from it. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. She was lying to my son about my mental health. She was trying to plant the idea that I was incompetent, that I couldn't be trusted, that my memory was failing. And if she succeeded, if Thomas believed her, then any accusation I made against her would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman losing her grip on reality. It was perfect. Evil, but perfect. I went downstairs and made myself a cup of tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd raised Thomas, where we'd built a life, and I tried to understand how my son had married someone capable of this kind of calculated cruelty. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had I been so eager to welcome her into the family that I'd ignored red flags? Or was she just that good at hiding who she really was? Thomas called that afternoon, and I almost told him everything right then. Almost. But when I heard his voice, tired and stressed from his business trip, asking how things were going with Rachel, I found myself saying, "Everything's fine, honey. Rachel's been wonderful company." Because I realized that if I told him over the phone, if I made these accusations without being able to show him the proof, she would get to him first with her story about my dementia. I had to wait. I had to do this face to face. "Mom, Rachel mentioned you've been a little forgetful lately," Thomas said, and my heart sank. It had already started. She'd already begun poisoning him against me. "She said you left the stove on twice last week, and you couldn't remember what day your book club meets." These were lies. Complete lies. I'd never left the stove on. My book club met on Tuesdays like it had for 15 years, but I could hear the concern in his voice, the way he was starting to see me differently. "Thomas," I said carefully, "I promise you I'm fine. My memory is perfectly sharp. I think maybe Rachel misunderstood some things." But even as I said it, I could hear how it sounded. Like exactly what an elderly person with declining cognitive function would say. She'd backed me into a corner where defending myself made me look more guilty. It was masterful manipulation, and I hated that I'd underestimated her so completely. After I hung up with Thomas, I called Martin. I told him everything. The nighttime visit, the emails, Rachel's plan to contest the will and claim I'd promised her my valuables. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Martin finally spoke, his voice was grim. "Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What she's doing might not be illegal. Not yet. But it's close. And if anything happens to you, even something that looks like an accident, she'll have positioned herself to claim everything." "What do I do?" I asked. And I hated how small my voice sounded, how frightened. I was 73 years old. I'd survived cancer, the loss of my husband, years of loneliness. But this woman, this stranger my son had married, had made me afraid in my own home. Martin told me to document everything, write down every interaction, keep recording, and most importantly, change my will immediately. Add a clause specifically stating that Rachel had never been promised any of my possessions, that any claims she made to the contrary were false. That evening, Rachel came home from her yoga class. I'd stopped believing anything she told me, and found me in the kitchen making dinner. She was all smiles and warm energy, asking about my day, offering to help with the cooking. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to throw her out of my house. Instead, I smiled back and handed her a knife to chop vegetables, and I watched her hands as she worked. Capable hands, steady hands, dangerous hands. "Margaret, I wanted to talk to you about something," Rachel said as we sat down to eat. My stomach clenched. "Thomas and I have been talking, and we're a little worried about you. He mentioned you seemed confused on the phone today." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and it took everything I had not to pull away. "There's no shame in getting older. Maybe we should set up an appointment with a doctor just to make sure everything's okay." I looked into her eyes, brown and warm and completely empty of genuine concern, and I made a choice. I would play her game. I would pretend to be the confused old woman she was trying to paint me as, because if she thought she was winning, if she thought I was unaware of her schemes, she might get sloppy. She might make a mistake, and I would be there to catch it. "You know, Rachel, maybe you're right," I said slowly, letting my voice quaver just a little. "I have been feeling a bit foggy lately. Perhaps I should see someone." The relief that flashed across her face was unmistakable. She thought she'd won. She thought I was going to roll over and let her paint me as incompetent. But what she didn't know was that I'd already called 3 different doctors and scheduled appointments for comprehensive cognitive evaluations. I'd pass them all with flying colors, and I'd have medical documentation proving my mental fitness. That night, I lay in bed and thought about what my mother would have done in this situation. She'd lived through the Depression and the war, had hidden neighbors from the authorities, had kept secrets that could have gotten her killed. She'd taught me that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest. It was about being smarter than your enemies. It was about letting them think they'd won right up until the moment you pulled the rug out from under them. I decided I needed one more piece of evidence before I brought everything to Thomas. I needed Rachel to show her true intentions in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. So the next morning, I told her I was going to visit my sister Helen for the weekend, that I'd be leaving Friday morning and coming back Sunday night. I watched her face carefully as I said it. She tried to hide her excitement, but I saw it. That little flash of anticipation. 2 full days alone in my house, with unlimited access to everything I owned. But I wasn't going to Helen's. I was going to stay at a hotel 10 minutes away. And I was going to give Martin my spare key so he could install a professional security camera in my bedroom. The kind that was invisible, that recorded in high definition, that saved everything to the cloud automatically. If Rachel was going to make her move, it would be this weekend. And I was going to capture every single second of it. Friday morning came, and I put on my best performance. I packed a small overnight bag in front of Rachel, made a show of checking I had my phone charger and my medications. I told her there was plenty of food in the refrigerator, that she should help herself to anything she wanted. I even gave her a hug before I left, stood there in my front hallway and embraced this woman who was plotting against me, and felt her hug me back with the warmth of a perfect liar. I drove to the hotel and checked into a room with a view of the parking lot. Martin met me there an hour later with the camera equipment. We drove back to my house together, let ourselves in through the back door, and installed 3 cameras, one in my bedroom, one in the hallway, and one in the living room where I kept Robert's watch displayed in a glass case. The whole setup took less than 30 minutes, and then we were gone again, ghosts in my own home. Back at the hotel, Martin set up my laptop so I could watch the camera feeds in real time. We didn't have to wait long. At 2:35 p.m., less than 4 hours after I'd left, Rachel came home. She wasn't alone. A man was with her, tall, dark-haired, around her age. They were laughing together as they walked through my front door. The way he touched her lower back, the way she leaned into him. This wasn't a friend. This was someone much more than that. I watched the screen as they moved through my house, and what I saw made me feel physically sick. They went into my bedroom, and the man started going through my things while Rachel directed him. "That's the Rolex," she said, pointing to the nightstand drawer. "Worth at least 15 grand? And the jewelry box is in the closet, top shelf, inside the hat box." She knew exactly where everything was. She'd memorized it all during her nighttime visits. The man pulled out my jewelry box and started examining the pieces. Jesus, Rachel, this stuff is worth a fortune, he said. I could hear everything clearly. Martin had set up the cameras with excellent audio. When are you going to make your move? Rachel laughed, and the sound of it made my skin crawl. Not yet, Marcus. We have to be patient. The old bat needs to kick off first. But when she does, I'll have all the documentation I need to claim half this stuff was promised to me. Thomas won't fight it. He already thinks she's losing her mind. Marcus. The name from the emails. This was Rachel's partner in crime. Maybe more than that. I looked at Martin, whose face had gone pale. We were watching a conspiracy unfold in real time. They spent the next hour going through my house room by room, Marcus filming everything on his phone while Rachel provided commentary like she was giving a tour. This painting is an original. That china set is 19th century. Those first edition books are probably worth thousands. At one point, Marcus suggested they just take some things now while I was gone. But Rachel shook her head. No. If anything goes missing before she dies, it'll raise questions. We need this to look clean. She dies. Natural causes, heart attack, whatever. And then I discover that she'd promised me all these items. I have the photos of me wearing the jewelry. I have emails where I can say she told me these things would be mine someday. Thomas won't challenge it because he'll be grieving and guilty and he already thinks his mom is confused. And if she doesn't die soon? Marcus asked. Rachel's smile was cold and calculating. She's 73. How long can she last? But if we need to speed things up, well, accidents happen to old people all the time. They fall downstairs. They forget to turn off the gas. They take too many of their heart pills. My hand flew to my mouth. Was she actually suggesting what I thought she was suggesting? Martin grabbed my arm, his grip tight. We have her, he whispered. Margaret, we have her. You know, sometimes you think you understand how dark the human heart can be, but then you hear someone casually discuss murdering you in your own home, and you realize you never really knew what evil looked like until it was standing in your bedroom, going through your dead husband's possessions. They stayed in my house for 3 more hours. They drank my wine, ate my food, and talked about their plans. Rachel mentioned that she'd already started transferring small amounts of money from Thomas's account. Money she said was for household expenses, but was actually going into a separate account she'd opened without his knowledge. She talked about how after I died, she'd convinced Thomas to sell my house and split the proceeds. She talked about my funeral like she was planning a vacation. When they finally left, driving away in Marcus's car with their arms around each other, I sat in that hotel room and cried, not just for myself, but for Thomas. My boy had married a monster, and he had no idea. He thought she loved him. He thought they were building a life together, but she was using him as a tool to get to my money, my house, my possessions. Everything Robert and I had built over 50 years of marriage, she wanted to take it all and leave nothing but ashes. Martin downloaded all the footage and made multiple copies. We had everything we needed now. Rachel on camera going through my things, discussing her plans to claim my belongings, suggesting she might accelerate my death if necessary. It was enough to destroy her. Enough to send her to prison, probably. But I had to be strategic about how I used it, because she'd already planted seeds of doubt about my mental state with Thomas. And if I wasn't careful, she could still spin this as the paranoid fantasies of an elderly woman. Sunday afternoon, I returned home right on schedule. Rachel greeted me with a warm hug and asked about my visit with Helen. I told her it had been lovely, that we'd had a wonderful time catching up. She made me tea and sat with me in the kitchen, asking about my weekend with such genuine-seeming interest that if I hadn't watched her on camera, planning my death, I might have believed she actually cared. The performance was flawless. Absolutely flawless. That night, Thomas called to say he'd be home Monday evening. His business trip was wrapping up a day early. My heart leaped. This was it. Tomorrow I would show him everything. The videos, the emails, the camera footage from the weekend. I'd destroy Rachel's carefully constructed lies with the truth, and finally, I'd be safe in my own home again. I barely slept that night, rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain it all without sounding like the confused old woman Rachel had tried to make me seem. But Monday morning, everything changed. I came downstairs to find Rachel sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret," she sobbed, "I need to tell you something. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I realized with a dropping sensation in my stomach that somehow, impossibly, she knew that I knew. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Rachel sat there at my kitchen table, mascara running down her cheeks, her whole body shaking with sobs that looked completely real. For a split second, I wondered if I'd been wrong about everything, if maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. But then I remembered her voice on that camera footage, cold and calculating as she discussed speeding up my death. No amount of tears could erase that. "What are you sorry for, Rachel?" I asked quietly, my hand gripping the back of a chair to keep myself steady. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, and for a moment she didn't say anything, just stared at me like she was trying to decide something. Then she took a shaky breath and said, "I know you saw the cameras. Marcus noticed one of them yesterday when we were leaving. The lens caught the light. My blood turned to ice. She knew. She'd known since yesterday that I'd been watching." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice came out wrong, too tight, too defensive. Rachel shook her head and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Please don't lie to me, Margaret. I can't take any more lies." The audacity of that statement, coming from her mouth after everything she'd done, almost made me laugh. But there was something in her voice, something that didn't match the cruel, calculating woman I'd seen on camera. She sounded broken, defeated. She stood up from the table and walked to the window, her back to me. "I need to tell you the truth. The whole truth. And then you can do whatever you want with it." I stayed where I was, my fingers digging into the chair back, every muscle in my body tense. This could be another manipulation, another lie designed to make me lower my guard. But something told me to listen, to wait and see what she would say. "My real name isn't Rachel Chen," she began, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "It's Rebecca Thornton. And 3 years ago, my mother died in a nursing home in Ohio." She turned to face me, and the expression on her face was raw and painful. "She died alone, Margaret. She died calling for me, and I wasn't there because I was too busy building my career in New York. By the time I got there, she'd been dead for 6 hours. I didn't say anything. I just stood there and listened as Rachel, continued. After she died, I found out that the nursing home had been stealing from her, taking her jewelry, her mother's ring, little things she'd saved her whole life to pass down to me. The staff had been going into her room at night while she slept. They documented everything she owned, and then, piece by piece, it all disappeared. When I tried to report it, they had paperwork saying she'd given those things away, that she'd been confused, that her memory was failing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture I hadn't expected. When I met Thomas," she continued, "I loved him. I really did. But then I met you, and you had so much. This big house, all these beautiful things, and you were alone, just like my mother had been alone. And something inside me just broke." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "I started thinking, what if someone was doing to you what they did to my mom? What if Thomas was planning to put you in a home and take everything? So you decided to take it first?" I asked, and my voice came out sharper than I'd intended. She flinched. "No, I mean, yes. I don't know. I started documenting everything because I thought I was protecting it, protecting you. But then it became something else. It became about my mother, about replacing what I'd lost, about making sure that if you died alone like she did, at least I'd have something to remember you by." The logic was twisted, sick, but I could hear genuine pain underneath it. "And Marcus?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "Marcus is my therapist, was my therapist. We crossed boundaries we shouldn't have crossed. He was helping me work through my mother's death, and then he started helping me document your assets, and it all spiraled into something neither of us meant it to become. That conversation you heard, about speeding up your death, that was him, not me. He was testing me, pushing me to see how far gone I really was. And I didn't stop him because part of me wanted to see too. I pulled out a chair and sat down because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. Rachel, Rebecca, you talked about me dying like it was inevitable, like it was convenient. She moved toward me and I instinctively pulled back. She stopped, holding her hands up. I know how it sounded. But Margaret, I swear to you, I never would have hurt you. That weekend when you were gone, when Marcus was pushing me to actually do something, I couldn't. I looked at your bedroom, at your things, at the pictures of you and Robert, and I broke down. The cameras caught you crying, I said slowly, remembering a section of footage I hadn't mentioned before. After Marcus left, Rachel had sat on my bedroom floor for almost an hour, sobbing. At the time, I'd thought it was an act. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was the first genuine thing I'd seen from her. She nodded. I called him after he left and told him I couldn't do it, that I was going to confess everything to you and Thomas. He got angry, said I was throwing away months of planning. That's when I knew how far I'd fallen. She sat down at the table across from me, and we looked at each other for a long moment. This morning, I was supposed to meet Marcus at a lawyer's office to finalize our plan to contest your will, but I couldn't do it. Instead, I came here to tell you everything, to beg you to forgive me, even though I know I don't deserve it. Her voice cracked. I became the thing I hated most. I became the people who stole from my mother, and I almost stole everything from you. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock Robert had hung there 30 years ago. I'd imagined this confrontation 100 different ways, but never like this. Never with her sitting across from me, broken and honest and admitting everything without me having to show her a single piece of evidence. I have videos, I said finally. I have everything recorded. The nighttime visits, your emails, this weekend with Marcus, all of it. I know, she whispered. And you should use them. You should show Thomas everything. You should call the police. I've probably committed 6 crimes. She pulled her phone from her pocket and slid it across the table to me. Here, my phone. All my emails with the lawyer, with Marcus, everything. Take it. Use it. I'm not going to fight you. She stood up and walked toward the stairs. I'll pack my things and be gone in an hour. And Margaret, I'm so sorry for all of it. I sat there holding her phone, my mind racing. This could still be a manipulation. A performance designed to make me feel sorry for her, to keep me from showing Thomas the evidence. But something about the way she'd told her story, the way her voice had broken when she mentioned her mother, it felt real. It felt like the first true thing that had passed between us since she'd moved into my house. I thought about what my mother would have done, and I thought about what Robert would have wanted me to do. Rachel? I called out before she reached the stairs. She stopped, her hand on the banister, but didn't turn around. I need to know one thing. Did Thomas know? Was he part of any of this? She spun around and the look on her face was pure horror. God, no. Margaret, no. Thomas has no idea. He loves you. He thinks I love you too. This was all me and my damage. Please don't let my sickness poison what you have with your son. I believed her. Maybe I was a fool to believe her, but I did. Don't pack your things yet, I said slowly. Sit down. We need to talk. She stood there frozen, like she couldn't quite process what I was saying. Margaret, you don't owe me anything. You should hate me. I probably should have. Any reasonable person would have. But I kept thinking about her mother, dying alone, calling for a daughter who came too late. I kept thinking about my own loneliness in this big house, and how grief can twist us into people we never meant to become. I do hate what you did, I said carefully. I hate that you violated my privacy, that you plotted against me, that you made me afraid in my own home. But I don't hate you, because I understand something about loss and what it can do to a person. She started crying again, but this time it was different, quieter, more real. She sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. I don't understand. Why aren't you throwing me out? Why aren't you calling the police right now? Because, I said, 20 years ago, I did something I'm not proud of. After Robert's first heart attack, when we thought he might die, I went through his office looking for his life insurance policy. But while I was searching, I found letters from a woman he'd had an affair with 10 years earlier. And instead of confronting him while he was recovering, instead of being the bigger person, I kept those letters. I planned to use them if we ever divorced. I became someone I didn't recognize. I'd never told anyone that story. Not my sister, not my friends, not even Robert before he died. In the end, I burned those letters without ever mentioning them, because I realized that holding on to that poison was destroying me more than it was protecting me. So I understand, Rachel. I understand how grief and fear can make you do terrible things you never thought you were capable of. She was staring at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. But that doesn't mean there aren't consequences. What do you want from me? She asked. I took a deep breath. First, you're going to cut off all contact with Marcus, immediately. And you're going to give me written documentation of everything he did, everything he suggested, every plan he pushed you toward. Because while I might understand your pain, I don't forgive his manipulation of it. She nodded quickly. Second, you're going to see a real therapist. Not Marcus. Someone I choose. Someone who specializes in grief and trauma. And you're going to do the work. Okay, she whispered. Anything. I stood up and walked to the drawer where I kept my important papers. I pulled out my will, the original one, the one Martin and I hadn't updated yet. I placed it on the table between us. Third, you're going to read this. You're going to see that everything I have goes to Thomas. Not because I don't trust you now, but because this was always the plan. And you're going to make peace with that. She picked up the will with shaking hands and read through it. When she finished, she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. I never wanted your things, Margaret. Not really. I wanted my mother back. I wanted to undo what happened to her. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that saving your things was the same as saving her. She placed the will back on the table. I know that doesn't make sense. I know how sick it sounds. It makes more sense than you think, I said quietly. But Rachel, you have to understand something. I'm not your mother. And you don't need to protect me from thieves because I'm not vulnerable the way she was. I'm alert. I'm aware. I'm strong. And I'm going to live for a long time yet. A small, broken smile crossed her face. I know that now. I'm so sorry it took me this long to see it. Thomas arrived home that evening. I'd spent the afternoon with Rachel, going through every email, every photo, every piece of her plan. She handed over everything without resistance, her phone, her laptop, printed copies of her conversations with Marcus. She called Marcus in front of me and told him it was over, that if he ever contacted her again, she'd report him to the state licensing board for ethics violations. I heard him yelling through the phone, heard the threats, but she stayed firm. When Thomas walked through the door, he found both of us in the kitchen, drinking tea like two old friends. The confusion on his face would have been funny under different circumstances. Mom? Rachel? What's going on? Rachel looked at me, and I could see the question in her eyes. I'd promised her we would tell him together, but that I'd decide how much to reveal. I'd spent all afternoon thinking about it. Thomas, sit down, I said gently. Rachel has something she needs to tell you. For the next hour, we told him a carefully edited version of the truth. Rachel confessed that she'd been struggling with grief over her mother's death, that she'd become obsessive about protecting my assets because of what had happened to her mother, that she'd crossed boundaries she shouldn't have crossed. She told him about documenting my valuables, about the emails to the estate lawyer. But we didn't tell him about Marcus. We didn't tell him about the conversation about speeding up my death. Some truths would destroy their marriage beyond repair, and I wasn't sure that was what needed to happen here. Thomas's face went through a dozen different emotions: shock, anger, confusion, hurt. He looked at Rachel like he was seeing a stranger. You went through Mom's things? You were planning to contest her will? Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't in my right mind, Tommy. I know that's not an excuse. I know I betrayed both of you, but I'm getting help, real help. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this right. He turned to me. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me the moment you found out? I reached across and took his hand. Because, sweetheart, I needed to understand what was really happening before I involved you. And I needed to give Rachel a chance to come forward on her own, which she did. That wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough. Thomas looked back and forth between us, clearly struggling to process everything. I think, I said carefully, that Rachel needs to move out for a while. You two need space to figure out if your marriage can survive this. And I need my house back to myself. Rachel nodded immediately. I've already started looking at apartments. I'll be out by the end of the week. Thomas just sat there, his head in his hands. I don't know if I can forgive this, he said finally. I don't know if we can come back from this. Maybe you can't, I said gently. And that's okay. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. What Rachel did was wrong. Terribly wrong. But it came from a place of unresolved grief and trauma, not malice. She's not a monster. She's a broken person who made terrible choices. And we all have that capacity inside us when we're in enough pain. He looked at me with his father's eyes, and I could see Robert in him so clearly in that moment. How can you be so calm about this, Mom? She violated your privacy. She was planning to steal from you. Because 20 years ago, your father and I went through something that taught me about forgiveness. And because holding on to anger would hurt me more than it would hurt her. I squeezed his hand. I'm not saying you have to forgive her right now. I'm not even saying you have to stay married. But I am saying that people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. And I think Rachel is willing. Rachel moved out 3 days later. Before she left, she stood in my kitchen and handed me a letter. Don't read this now, she said. Read it when you're ready. Or don't read it at all. But I needed to write it. We looked at each other for a long moment, and then, to my own surprise, I pulled her into a hug. She stiffened at first, then collapsed against me, sobbing. Thank you, she whispered against my shoulder. Thank you for seeing me as more than the worst thing I've ever done. After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by all the things she'd wanted to take. Robert's watch, my mother's pearls, my grandmother's ring. They were just objects. Beautiful, valuable objects with memories attached, but objects nonetheless. What mattered was that I was safe, that I'd protected myself and my son, that I'd chosen compassion over revenge. I opened the letter Rachel had given me. Inside was a single photograph and 3 sentences. The photo showed a woman who looked remarkably like Rachel, lying in a hospital bed, her hand reaching toward the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, Mom, 1 day before. I'm sorry I wasn't there for the last day. The 3 sentences read, Your mercy gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. The chance to be a person my mother would be proud of. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend my life trying to earn it. Thank you for teaching me what grace looks like. 6 months have passed since that morning in my kitchen. Rachel and Thomas are separated but going to couples counseling. She's in intensive therapy, working through her grief and the choices she made. She calls me once a week and we talk. Carefully at first, but with growing honesty. We may never be close, but we're building something. Understanding, maybe. Or just the acknowledgement that we're both human, both capable of darkness, both trying to be better. Thomas came to visit last Sunday, and we sat in the same kitchen where everything had fallen apart. I still don't understand how you forgave her, he said. I poured us both coffee and thought about how to explain it. I didn't forgive her right away, I said. And I'm not sure I've completely forgiven her even now. But I decided that holding on to that anger would turn me into someone I didn't want to be. It would make me bitter and suspicious and afraid. And your father and I didn't build this life so I could spend my final years as a prisoner in my own home. He nodded slowly. She told me about Marcus, about how far it almost went. I hadn't known Rachel had told him. That was her choice to make, and I was proud of her for making it. And you're still going to counseling? He sighed. Yeah. I don't know if we're going to make it, Mom, but I need to try. Because you're right. She's not a monster. She's just someone who got lost in her grief. And maybe I can help her find her way back. Have you ever been through something like this? Something that challenged everything you thought you knew about forgiveness and justice? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I read every single one. Life gives us these impossible choices sometimes, these moments where there's no clear right answer. We can choose anger or understanding, revenge or mercy, punishment or redemption. I chose mercy. I chose to believe that people can change, that grief doesn't have to define us forever, that second chances matter. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe Rachel will disappoint me again. But I'd rather be a fool who believes in redemption than a cynic who sees only the worst in people. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to survive our losses, trying to make sense of a world that takes away the people we love. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is look at someone who hurt us and say, I see your pain, and I choose to respond with grace.